One of the things that makes 361 so special is the way the community comes together to educate each other each week. I'm fortunate to kick it off, but it's really the commentary that goes after that really drives and makes, I think, the Tuesday briefing so successful. And this week I'm joined by Francis, who's going to join us live from China, who's going to share his on-the-ground views from there. I'll talk about it from a macro, and then we'll be joined by somebody from Control Risk to share their perspectives as well. But the topic is sleepwalking into conflict, and it appears that, which appears to be the course that the U.S. and China are taking right now, as things are heating up now that President-elect Trump and President Xi will do round two. And I suspect that things will heat up quickly, and the possibility for a major policy mistake is quite real. So let's jump into it. I'm going to go through my slides pretty quickly so we can get to Francis and then get into Q&A because there's a lot to cover. But the foreign policy approach of each is fascinating to observe. Both want to contain the power of the other while currying favor and collecting benefits from the rest of the world. For the U.S., we've used military support while China's focused more on economic support. But I think to understand how this really plays out, I think you have to understand how each side might define victory. I think for the U.S., victory would be undermining China's rise while preserving our role as the preeminent of global preeminence and forcing China to accept the current role it has or risk economic stagnation and diplomatic isolation, which I think is a pretty lofty goal. I don't think it's fully realistic. For China, the victory would not necessarily be a new world order with China at the center, although that would be the desire, but a significantly revised international system that better serves China's interest and influence. China wants a multipolar world where it can be viewed as an equal to the U.S., if not superior. The U.S. has been focused on direct containment, where China's taken a more indirect approach, and it is fascinating to see how countries line up for either one. But it's really important when you think about how this plays out on the rest of the world, given the sheer size of the economic contribution of each, and you add to it India and Indonesia and Brazil, countries that are trying to figure out how to benefit from this conflict between the two. How do they play both sides against the middle? So I think it's a really kind of fascinating dynamic that's at play, but also a scary one. In part because both countries have big near-term problems. They're well known, but I think the U.S. approach to contain China's rise, it may work, but it risks alienating allies and neutral countries. I think China could erode U.S. influence, but there's growing skepticism about its intentions and methods, particularly part of the Belt and Road initiatives, where countries have been left a little worse for wear, and China gains more from that. But I think as China's growth slows and its domestic challenges worsen, it makes the Chinese model a little bit more suspect, although I think that's a short-term issue for China. I think their approach will win out over the long run for getting their economy back on track, not necessarily upsetting the U.S. position. But I think the battle that's playing out is really going to be one based on the battle for AI. Back in 2017, Putin had this comment. And then there's a recent book called Genesis by Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Mundy from Microsoft. And you can see the quotes here. I do think they're right. I think that leadership in this area does put you in a very unique position. But I think it's really who maximizes the potential that's going to really win. And we know there's big spend going on from U.S. and China, other countries as well. South Korea, Japan are picking it up, Taiwan a little bit more. But really, Europe, as we talked about the last couple of weeks, has been slow to get their act together. And the fragmentation of Europe doesn't allow Europe to get the scale of many global leaders in the tech area. They have several like ASML, but you need more global leaders and more scale to compete with the U.S. and China champions because they play off each other. So while there's a lot of talk about what the U.S. might do to China with tariffs, I wonder, is the U.S. really focused on China's response? You can see the tariffs, since tariffs come in, imports of the U.S. have declined considerably. It picked up with Mexico and Canada, but Mexico is now under the spotlight too, and Trudeau is down trying to avoid tariffs last week. So this is a big issue about the negotiation or actual policy. So our take on it is everyone's waiting to see how President Trump and President Xi want to play this. But in the meantime, they're looking at ways to ease imbalances. Taiwan, right off the bat, day after the election, was talking about buying more military equipment from the U.S. Lagarde was out the other day being quite vocal about it. Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago to try and avoid tariffs. Sheinbaum was on the phone with Trump very early on, as there's big concerns about the impact of tariffs, not only on those countries, but on companies doing business with them. In the meantime, China is doing a really good job of building relations with the global South, but can they continue to support those needs? I think one of the challenges for the U.S. and for China is, can we continue to support all these other nations and all their initiatives while dealing with our own domestic problems when debt and deficits in the U.S. are a problem, and certainly debt and low growth is a pretty significant problem for China. I think the other issue is, will the bond markets let governments continue to spend the way they are, or do they have to rein in spending, which will slow down growth? And does that slow down the economies too much in those areas is one of the things we need to think about. We're still focused on the key areas. I think there was an interesting announcement today with China on some export controls on rare earth materials, and we own MP materials in our portfolio. That was up 10% earlier this morning based on that news, as China's looking to start to cripple the tech area if sanctions get too difficult. I think the industrial and defense area is obviously one that this group is playing both in the private markets and in the public markets. We continue to see those areas attracting significant capital. I think energy and healthcare are two of the biggest beneficiaries of AI, and financial companies eventually will benefit from AI as well. But during this time, the U.S. remains the best economy in a world in transition. And I think the reason for that is we continue to suck money out of the rest of the world. In recent weeks, I've showed capital flows from foreign direct investments into the U.S. We've talked about the reshoring that's going on. This is stock flows year to date and in the past month. And you can see the U.S. continues to attract a lot of capital. So I used to believe, I am a big believer in the U.S. I believe in U.S. exceptionalism, although I think it's taken several hits in the last couple of years. But when it comes to the economy, I think U.S. exceptionalism still is real. I think our companies are among the ones that are driving the global economy forward. And I think we continue to suck capital out of the rest of the world, and that positions us well for moving forward. So Mark, I think we should move it over to Francis, and we come back for questions if that works for you. Let's see, Mark, so go ahead, Francis, you're on. And you're on mute.
So let me
back up the slideshow at the top.
Oops, there you go. Okay, you guys got that as a slideshow, or do you have the next slide?
You have to do the display settings again.
Even as an expert, Francis, he's done this for 240 weeks in a row.
Under video.
You go up to the top taskbar.
See where it says show taskbar display settings?
Yeah,
Right?
I got you.
You got it.
Swap. All right. So what I'm going to talk about is now we got the right screens, right, guys?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about, what I'm calling round two. This is the second time that sort of Trump is facing off, and I like the analogy to him and his boxing in Atlantic City. Um, and I think the picture that I've already shown you is probably the one that's here is what is on everyone's mind in terms of when they think about Trump and his trade war related to China, and that basically, um, the U.S. is shooting themselves in the foot with this trade war. And I think it tells a lot of things about how the general sort of neoclassical or the classical economists will take a look at how Trump is trying to manage China. And I think it does a lot to shortchange what is actually going on. And I think when I look at the fundamentals of what the ideas basically that are driving Trump's position, I think they boil down to first and foremost the phase one trade agreement, which started under the first Trump administration and was finally signed in January of 2020. There's a phase two of that trade agreement, which was under discussions, which was never negotiated and never signed, and not really paid attention to by the Biden administration. And then floating around these things are ideas about the WTO accords, China's ascension to the WTO, national security, and trade balance. And I think this when Trump is coming to negotiate with China on the trade agreements that we have with China, I think these are the fundamental concepts that he's talking about. And when one looks at, let's say, the phase one agreements, it's really not about a trade balance at all. It's mostly about intellectual property, technology transfer, some agricultural buys to feed some of the United States voter blocks, financial services. It's expanding trade more broadly, and it's about dispute resolution. These are the fundamental pieces of the puzzle that Trump is trying to put in place. And the phase two it's building on all what is in phase one, and it's primarily focused on market access, and then data and cybersecurity. And the challenge really is that some of the things that are in there really challenge the control of the CCP in China. And that's why negotiations basically stalled. Now, if we go back and take what is Trump going to ask for on day one, I think what he's going to do is say, okay, we signed phase one in January 2020. We haven't really made very much progress, and the implementation has been slow. So he's going to push for demonstrable results there, and he's going to impose new deadlines and telegraph penalties related to it. I think the same thing as with phase two. He's going to say the documents are already written, drafts have been distributed to people. We're going to restart these negotiations. He's probably going to add more on top of that. And same thing, push for detailed objectives, timelines, deadlines, penalties. The WTO commitments, it's if you go back and read some of the documents on the USTR that they've been publishing lately, it's just a stunning lack of progress on what's actually been accomplished in WTO, just the basics of whether China adheres to WTO. So Trump's going to again draw attention to these failings, and it's about market access, technology transfers, and regulatory reforms. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Trump is basically looking for what was written in Lighthizer book, his most recent book, which is basically his job application, it's about reciprocity and market access. So now, the last time these two teams met, the sort of Trump telegraphed what he wanted. He had initial tariffs in 2018. The Chinese didn't take him seriously. He put a second wave in March, a third wave in June, a fourth wave in July. And eventually that market impact was, let's say if it was 25% as a total, the suppliers ate some of that, renminbi depreciation ate some of those costs. We had tax rebates and subsidies in China. We had shrinkflation in the markets in the United States. And we had some higher prices and also higher margins for importers, brands, and distributors. Final assembly has been moving out of China. In some components, it has not been moving out of China. And the interesting thing is that China's overall share of global trade has increased over this period because a lot of the intermediate goods have been going to Southeast Asia and Mexico for the final assembly to skirt the US tariffs. I think in the next round of negotiations, if Trump doesn't see progress on market access, reciprocity, and all the other things I've talked about, I think we're going to start to see tariffs also get put in place in a lot of these other markets, so that EVs can't be put together in Mexico just to skirt the U.S. Objectives. Within China, I think they're going to work on devaluing the currency. We've already seen that already. The RMB is now at 7.3. That's the highest it's been or the lowest it's been in a long time. And from a diplomatic perspective, I think that China will continue to play this game of slow walking, trying to become the leader of the global South, trying to play a divide and conquer with Europe, and to strengthen this axis that they're building with, I would say, the dregs of society in a way, but they are thinking that that's the future. So I think that China will both cooperate and confront the United States, and cooperation will take the form of giving the United States some market access, maybe doing some voluntary export restrictions, some tariff reductions and regulatory reform for imported products, and maybe some gifts to Lutnick and his friends in the financial services community to try and give them a little bit of access to the market, which is some of what the U.S. wants, but it also is the game that China has played in the past, basically giving goodies to people who will talk nice to the United States government or lobby on behalf of the Chinese in the U.S. Congress. On the confrontation side, I think we could see some type of live fire accident in the South China Seas to sort of show that there's test people's willingness to really confront China. I think we could see some export restrictions, as Stephen was just talking about earlier, in rare earths and things like that. We're trying to inflict some pain in the United States, and then also see overt and maybe less overt market restrictions put on particularly U.S. companies, or maybe market access given to places like Turkey and Hungary, who are playing nice with China in Europe, and so that it plays into that divide and rule piece. But you'll see that Trump on the team has this sort of good cop, bad cop with Lighthizer replacement and Lutnick. And so I think that China is going to start with some platitudes and inauthentic foot dragging with a smile, is what I'd like to say. There are ruder ways to say that, but I can't say them now. Okay, so I think it's important to keep in mind what we hear on the airwaves, and I think it's funny to see what some of the quotes that you'll find out there about how people are talking about what's actually going on. Kerr Gibbs is a person who's fairly well known in sinology circles or the business community of focusing on China, and here he's saying that Beijing basically can't buy anything else from the United States. There are no more airplanes or semiconductors that can really be bought. So I think this is kind of silly clickbait that's out there, which completely misses the mark, right? Because what I'm saying is they want market access. You think about it from this perspective of the U.S. companies don't really want to export to China. They already have manufacturing within China. The problem is about market access and favoritism within the Chinese economy. And then from the sort of the IMF perspective, or the classical trained economists that are out there, you have this kind of snide comments that Trump has no idea what he's doing. Engaging with his conversations is like it's trying to play chess with a rhino. And so as one more quote that I thought would be funny too is that here's one jumbling his views, jumble of competing views for the president's ear. So it's important to also keep in mind that a lot of this is what I call is thinly veiled contempt for Trump, and this keeping in mind the Trump derangement syndrome that's out there. That's going to cloud everything that's happening in the press related to what's going on. So it's very difficult to understand. It's going to be very difficult to follow this story if you're not close to it. And the other thing I think you'll see is the mindless chanting of USA and the United States, and this ridiculous sort of China getting out there and saying that they're the defender of the free world. They're the defender of the trading world. So be aware of these things. And now I want to talk a little bit, take a few minutes to talk a little bit about what I think will happen in the context of China to drive the changes. And so when you look at the Chinese economy, I think it's important to understand that the two things that are really pulling at China right now is socioeconomic stress and state control. These two things are the main tensions within society right now. And this is balancing on top of a whole bunch of other competing problems that are out there. We have things that are making China more stable, such as the human and physical capital, the infrastructure, and the supply chain. And then we have these other things that are making China much more unstable and shaky. So demographics, debt, deflation, geopolitics. And that's all teetering on this socioeconomic stress. The higher it gets, the lower it gets, and that basically, and can the state control this quite difficult balancing act that they have? Within all of this, we then have geopolitics, right? So I call these basically black swans or gray rhinos are going to be a big part of this drama. The civil unrest is increasing in China, and sometimes it doesn't even have to be that big of an event for things to precipitate change. So for example, the end of COVID restrictions, there were only maybe a few thousand people who were demonstrating on the streets of Shanghai, and that changed, the policy. I think this whole idea of state control, there's a misperception, I think, in the West that this is, the one person is really in control of everything. And I think that that's a misreading of what's actually going on. There's one person who's certainly at the top of this organization, but is a much larger organization that's controlling everything. And that could change quite quickly. And that's something we need to watch out for. Chaos in the West is also very important in relative terms. So if the West is relatively chaotic, it shows that China is a stable place. Whereas if the West is growing and doing well, it basically draws more attention to one of the biggest problems that China has right now, which is the faltering economy. And then other intractable problems that I think are out there is certainly the relationship with Russia. How does Ukraine play out? And then the relationships that they have with Iran, Syria, North Korea. All of these will have a big impact on how the next stage of Chinese growth and how China responds to the United States. This issue of exporting their overcapacity. Of course, we have the wars potentials in the South China Sea, particularly around Taiwan and the Philippines these days. And then this sort of dystopian controlled future within China. These are problems that will haunt China for the next several years. So when I look at this as a potential medium-term outcomes, I think that there is basically 4 potential outcomes that we're going to look for within the Chinese economy. And as these 4 outcomes are impacted by state control and socioeconomic stress. So if we have lower socioeconomic stress, lower state control, we're probably going to have a reformed Chinese economy. And so that might be a world where there's an internal crisis initially, a political course correction, a warming of relations between the United States and China, some type of reform 2.0 is the scenario that would be there. And I think that's for us, is from an investor's perspective, this has the most upside. And so I start with something happy, because if you think about from a reform perspective and the potential for the Chinese economy to grow, there are some estimates that we've seen that the economy could grow by 8-10% for another 20 years if they were willing to institute some reforms. A successful China is one where there's a high level of control, particularly within Xi Jinping, and basically it's all-encompassing party-state control, technological independence from basically this bifurcation of the world into two separate places, some tangible success stories technologically, and then a successful power play with the global South. I don't think that China is doing a very good job with the global South. There's some wins there, but those markets are really not big enough. So they need some bigger successes and cooperation, particularly with places like India. They can't be clubbing people in India and expecting to have good relations with India. So a confrontational China is where the Chinese economy falters. There's tensions over Taiwan escalating. There's military confrontation direct with the United States. And then there's a sort of constrained China is one where the socioeconomic stress is high and the state control is low. And it's really just quite a messy place where Beijing fails to diversify the economy, maintain growth. But again, there's no reform. It's just basically a constrained economy. When I look at all these, I want to keep in mind that initially we're going to have a shaky China, and this market. So we're entering this stage where we have a shaky China, and then it will move to one of these other scenarios that we just discussed. And I think we have these internal and external dynamics that are playing in this cocktail, and then we have some combustion that happens, and somewhere around 2026, 2027, we shoot towards what I think are the more probable outcomes are reform or confrontation with the United States. I have one slide here which shows what I think the odds of these different things are. So I think we're basically moving into the shaky China right now. And if we go down to these are the black swans that are associated with it, and these are also the risks and rewards that I think people need to understand. And you'll see that in things like a successful China or a restrained China, there's going to be a very aggressive and capricious regulatory environment. So it's going to be very, very difficult for people to operate in these environments. So when I think what international investors need to prepare for are these scenarios where it is incredibly difficult to be an international company operating within the Chinese market. And then the upside of this is maybe if the reform movement comes, there'll be volatility initially, but there'll be very, very big payoffs for those who stay. Okay, so I want to keep this kind of quickly. I want to just finish here with what I think we're looking at initially. And so if you just read the blue initially, basically the politics revert to a centralized state. The geopolitics simmer but don't boil over. Global institutions make room for China. And then the militaries and the politicians and the pundits basically prepare for war. I think that's fundamentally the stage that we're walking into. Mark will make these slides available to people. So if we need them, I also wanted to show you one more thing in the sense that when we look at these different scenarios, I think it's important to understand that it moves in a way that So for example, the idea of a reformist China, it can happen with low and high socioeconomic stress. But this idea of a confrontational China is probably going to happen when there's high socioeconomic stress and very high state control. If people are really interested in this topic, I think this slide and a lot of this information comes from the source, which is in the lower left-hand corner, called Shaky China. Fantastic report by organization out of Europe. With that, I think I'll probably leave it there. Hope I didn't take too much time.
Mark, I did see that Daniel joined. Let's Mark around. Is that Daniel from Controlled Risks? Did I just see? Yeah, Daniel, you want to share your?
Yes, it is.
Thank you for joining. You want to share your thoughts and views?
Sure. I mean, on what topic do you want me to talk about? On the outlook of U.S. China under the coming Trump administration, is that
Yes,
right?
please.
So, I mean, I think, from control risk perspective, it's pretty much what you'd expect, which is that, we think, I'm not surprising anyone by saying that we expect U.S.-China relations to probably, remain broadly negative in the upcoming administration, with the U.S. continuing to expand trade and technology controls against China. There's just, very political room right now in Washington for any concessions to China, and the need to take a tough line on the country's view shared by both political parties, by apolitical bureaucrats and elected officials. I was at a dinner actually of kind of like China people that were either going to be in a Harris or a Trump administration about 2 months ago, right before the election. There was a pretty strong consensus on the Trump folks that that while Biden had expanded this toolkit of trade and tech controls, that they had been really weak at enforcing them, and that therefore Trump was going to come in and kind of close all the leaks in, for example, BIS, or stop granting so many exemptions to trade controls, the Section 301 tariffs. So frankly, the room kind of devolved into which of us is going to be tougher. I'm going to show you who's tougher kind of situation. So, I just kind of confirmed to us that it seems, at least initially under the Trump administration, things are probably going to stay at this kind of level of tension or get worse. And, that's indicated to us by the fact that all of the drivers in the past decade or so that have contributed to a downturn in relations, which includes trade, Taiwan, South China Sea, tech competition, various economic and supply chain issues, none of them have been or will be meaningfully addressed. And so, as a result of this, we'll see more of these de-risking, supply chain resiliency policies on the China side. And so that's just kind of the first point. The second is that, we're starting probably from a baseline of policies that were considered radical 8 years ago, but are now relatively accepted and remain under use under President Biden, just in terms of, kind of the scale and scope of tariffs and export controls. So we're starting from a much higher baseline this time around. And then I guess the final thing is that, of course, how did the Chinese respond to this, which is very relevant for companies, because obviously China has been kind of building out its own toolkit of export controls and anti-sanctions and retaliatory measures since about 2020. That includes obviously the anti-foreign sanctions law, the reform of the export control law, the unreliable entity list. And until now, we've seen them remain relatively restrained. Really, I think the only companies that have been on the unreliable entity list until about a month ago were, Raytheon, Lockheed, companies doing arms sales to Taiwan. But we just recently saw PVH Corp added to, or begin an investigation against PVH Corp, which is the parent company of Calvin Klein, due to unreliability in terms of sourcing from Xinjiang. So that's kind of one of the first measures we see of that being expanded beyond the kind of narrow confines of Taiwan arms sales. And so just a control risk, we think that China is much more likely to start flexing a little bit more than it has in the past in the coming 5 years for a few reasons. China probably believes it has greater capacity to endure a protracted struggle at this point than it did 8 years ago. It's less surprised. It also kind of has built up a lot of the self-reliance that it needs. Two, China's leadership has shown that it no longer prizes GDP growth above everything else. So that isn't, the only thing kind of pushing, their decision making. And three, standing up assertively for China's, national interests in the face of perceived Western and especially United States containment, right, is central to China's leadership identity. So that's kind of, the three thoughts I would say I have. U.S.-China relations are going to remain probably quite negative in the coming administration because none of the drivers have been addressed. They contributed to a downturn. The second is we're starting from a much higher baseline of tariffs and export controls. And third is that we think China is more likely to start hitting back a bit harder than we saw in the past 8 years.
Thank you, Mark. You on? Think we can open up for questions from the group now. So questions for Francis or Daniel?
Yeah, I have a question, if I may ask. Oh, sorry,
Please.
Adam probably raised.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, sure. I see Francis just shared the slides, which in the last one or two are saying that we will see the results in 2025 or 2026, either conform or either reform or confrontations. That timeline seems like very aggressive. Francis, could you elaborate a little bit more why you're seeing that? Because we are in the December of 2024. It's literally an aggressive scenario is 1 year down the line.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it does seem like an aggressive timeline, but I also think that the Chinese economy is in such a poor state at this point that it seems as though there's a short fuse for something to happen. And I'm of the opinion that that China is much weaker than many people on the outside, I think, are viewing it right now. And so I think it's in a very aggressive timeline, and I don't know that I really have. Frankly, I don't think any of us really have that great of insight into what's going on inside the inner workings of the CCP at this point. But I just think that the economy has been driving from ditch to ditch for so long now that it creates an opportunity for change, a catalyst for change.
If I could just add, Francis, one of your slides, you had the dumping on the rest of the world, and if they're not dumping on the U.S., they're oversupply, and they don't dump on Europe, then how long does the global South take that being the place that everything gets dumped on, and how do they move forward? So I think that's one of the things I'm like to hear your thoughts on.
Well, you see it already in EV markets, right? I mean, there's just so much capacity in EV solar panels, and I think that this idea of the friendships that China has with these different countries, I think are it's just tenuous at best. So I think that the overcapacity is a huge problem. And I'm not sure how countries can absorb all this, particularly. So if you take a look at a country like India, they want to have their own EVs, right? And so they're going to stop Chinese EVs as well.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, overcapacity, it's the US tends and increasingly, the EU and often countries around China tend to be the loudest about overcapacity concerns. But if you just look at the data since 2000, specifically, I was looking at NGO Global Trade Alert the other day, and after the United States, the countries that have implemented the highest number of import-related restrictions against China in the past 2 decades have been Argentina, Brazil, India, South Africa, and Russia, and the latter four of those are BRICS countries, right? And fall into that kind of, global South nickname that we give basically everyone that's not Europe or the United States. So So, I mean, the overcapacity is a major concern in global South countries. How each country individually responds to China is really varied. It depends on a number of factors, including the politics in those own countries, which are obviously not stable, as we saw in the past year, with half of them, half of the world going to elections. In some cases, like Indonesia in recent years, Philippines swapping from a, pro-China to a pro-US or vice versa government. There's very few kind of like anti-Western stalwarts in the global South, maybe Cambodia, maybe Myanmar. Many more of them are kind of, playing the field, so to speak, kind of a little bit more in the US lane on certain policies, a little bit more in the China lane on other policies, or in other cases, like I mentioned, kind of an election will happen and that'll kind of flip the script in terms of how they do. So it's very hard to generalize, but they are all concerned about overcapacity. Many of them are concerned about overcapacity for sure.
Yeah, or dominance of an industry as well. You see it in
Mm.
Indonesia with localizing production of nickel
Mhm.
and not having just ores going out, but actually finished products. So there's all of this forced. I mean, the Chinese are getting dished up their own medicine in the terms of forced technology transfers and forced joint ventures and all that stuff. And so it's a catalyst for change.
Mhm.
Adam, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah. Yes, my question is for Francis. I've got two questions for you, Francis. You had mentioned access to the markets to trade in China as one of the issues. And you're not talking about exports to China. I'm assuming you're talking about manufacturing and selling in the consumer market as Tesla has done, for example. So
I'm talking about almost all industries. So it could be, American Express wanting to distribute their credit services here in China, and Citibank wanting to have free and fair consumer banking licenses and not always getting sort of strung up in this written or unwritten regulation. And I think what we find is people are focused too much on the trade deficit numbers, where a lot of these companies really don't care about the trade deficit numbers. They want to be able to, for example, medical devices. There's a buy local law for medical devices that's in direct, conflict with the WTO accords. And so, there's a lot of specific reasons that specific things that China is doing to hinder market access. You had another question before I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah. The other question, separate topic, is the bromance between Russia and China, Xi and Putin, and North Korea in particular. Kim, do you have any thoughts on that? Is Xi really concerned about North Korea in any way, shape, or form?
I think like if we all lived next door to someone who was crazy, we would be concerned. I think the marriage with Russia is certainly one of convenience. It's one that's been playing out for a century in the sense of this trilateral relationship with the United States, and so it's been a boon for China in the terms of technology transfers, military technology transfers, cheap oil, screwing with the West and burning up blood and treasure. So it's a marriage of convenience, but I'm not so sure that it's if you ask the average person on the street, they would say that this is kind of a silly relationship for us, that we're sitting at the wrong table.
Do you have thoughts on that?
Stephen, Burke, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can just start testing our audio.
yes.
Daniel, do you want to add on to that at all before we go to the next question?
Sure. Somebody made a somewhat ominous comment that a talker was at the other day, which was something to the extent of the political and economic relationship right now between Russia and China is far more expansive than any relationship that ever existed between Japan and Germany in World War II. which is kind of it kind of goes back to actually what we were saying before, which is that, you know, the baseline of export controls and tariffs and kind of these restrictive policies on China, we're starting at a far higher baseline in 2025 than we did in 2017. At the same time, the international orbit of kind of alliances, the alliance structure around the world is also very different. I mean, as you mentioned, we've seen North Korea kind of moving further in the Russian camp. China and Russia, they have been, you know, since Xi Jinping came to power, they have really been, you know, kind of flirting with becoming much closer. But obviously, one of the big catalysts for that was the war. It's very much a marriage of convenience, and that Russia needs a lot of economic support. It also needs political support. That's something that China can easily provide without overstepping into the territory that would line China up for the kind of expansive sanctions against it that Russia has experienced. You know, China very much supports Iran in terms of, you know, kind of an oil relationship, but as Francis mentioned, you know, this is a relatively fragile, you know, cast of characters, right? Iran is very unhappy with China trying to underprice it on oil. So is Russia. China is very wary of Russia moving closer to North Korea into its own territory, as well as Vietnam. Different story. And then obviously also China is very wary of Russia overstepping and moving further into Europe, which could then, you know, further complicate China's own tenuous relationship with the EU right now. So it seems very strong until it isn't. I tend to think this alliance, you know, despite it being characterized as like the new Axis by some, especially in the U.S. government, I tend to think it's far more fragile than we believe. But you know, the new administration is going to have to contend with a very, very different geopolitical situation, which means probably, you know, far less scope for deals with North Korea this time around, which is also, I think, probably reflected in, you know, their stronger attempts, it appears, to pivot into Asia and really focus all of their resources on the Indo-Pacific. But sorry, that's all very speculative, but that's kind of, I think, how we think about it at Control Risk.
I have a
Was-
question, and I'm
it's-
not sure if it's for Stephen or Francis, but we're entering into a really interesting 1 to 2 year period. I think Donald Trump has 2 years to create his legacy, and he's either going to get an additional 2 years or not. And we know he's very aggressive out of the box, right? With his 25% tariff threats on Russia or on Mexico and China and Canada, despite his USMCA agreement. His comments yesterday about Hamas and the hostages, and his threats of being incredibly aggressive. So I guess my and speed is of the essence, and certainly he is going to be. You know, we know he's on January 20th. He's going to be. He might. I think he may skip the parade and go right to the Oval Office and start signing things. Stephen, what do you think is going to be, you know, a tell in the economy, a tell in the a speed governor? You know, how do we sit and watch the actions and the reactions and think about what you know, what course corrections may or may not be correct?
I think in the US, watch the 10-year. The bond vigilantes will put some restraints on how much spending, what his tax plans might be. I don't believe anyone truly thinks that the tariffs themselves will offset the tax cuts. So I think this is going to be one where the bond market's going to drive Trump and the stock market's going to drive Trump more than any other president. I think that's one of the things to watch. Also, keep an eye on how many companies or countries start redirecting trade to the US. And he'll count that as wins. He's already getting them already. Taiwan, you know, day after the election, was talking about buying defense. You have Lagarde, as I mentioned, already saying, let's work with the US. that's the wins for Trump. I think that's how he'll gauge it. I think the market will look at it. The bond market will be a restraint on it, on some of his plans.
We have one more question, Wilmot, if you want to ask it.
Sure, thank you. So I think this was addressed somewhat in the comments about the global south generally, as well as overcapacity, but specifically as it relates to the chess game between superpowers in Africa, Russia, China, US, some perceive as sort of late to the game. Any thoughts on the signaling from how the Trump administration may approach Africa? Biden, of course, just is leaving Angola, I think, for highly strategic visit there over access to minerals and trade routes. Thank you.
Daniel or Francis?
Maybe Daniel on that one.
Sure. I wish I myself am an Asia person, so I'm not super read up on Africa, but I mean, I think that, the Trump administration one major tool that I think the Trump administration had and that it actually created in 2018 was the Development Finance Corporation, right? By merging US OPIC and some elements of USAID, created this new body that at the time it touted as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's actually, I believe, in the text of the bill, something like to counter authoritarian regimes investing in third countries or something like that. And then under the Biden, if you read Project 2025, this it was really disparaged under the Biden administration how Biden had used development finance, but also just kind of foreign aid more broadly to achieve certain what the Project 2025 authors termed as woke issues related to climate, related to promoting development finance as long as you conform to certain like progressive gender issues, climate, all of these kind of things. But I've just seen, in the past few weeks, the Republicans really want to kind of move back to that solely countering China development finance, China Belt and Road, at least in Africa. They want to refocus the DFC's core mission on that. So I think that, we're probably just going to see, at least from the foreign aid perspective, we're going to see a far more kind of like transactional, here is what we're building, here is directly how the US gains benefits, for example, sourcing critical minerals or some sort of core benefit foreign policy interest of the United States, far less of the incorporating other elements of the political agenda into foreign policy making. And I think that's true for Africa, but I think more broadly it's true kind of across the board. We're going to see far less reliance on requiring things like high climate standards or whatever. It's like, no, here is a trade deal with you. Here is foreign aid. What we want is more critical minerals. What we want is you to cut out China from your supply chain, whatever, but in a very kind of narrowly focused way, which is to basically counter Chinese influence across the board, be that in Africa, be that in APAC, be that in the Middle East or wherever.
Thanks, Daniel. Last comments on that or other questions, Francis and Stephen? And then we need to transition.
Just one thing on the Chinese influence in Africa. I think it's often overstated the impact of BRI, and that if you were to ask the man on the street in Africa, how do you feel about Chinese, negative or positive? I think the negative perspective would be much, much higher. And conversely, with the United States, they would have a by and large a better grading in terms of soft power, and so I think that the Chinese influence in Africa is overstated.